Hi there, I'm Philip Ideson, the founder of Art of Procurement. And at Art of Procurement, we help procurement professionals like you plan and deliver change with confidence. Whether it's through the mapping and prioritization of your change journey, securing the subject matter expertise that you need to help you along the way, or assisting you and your team to take action on what they learn, and what's really important is on also what they already know. And of course, a big part of what we do is this weekly podcast where we share strategies and tactics that aim to inspire and help elevate your change journey. I want to thank you for joining me today. Let's go straight into the show. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to This Month in Procurement for February of 2009. And as last month, I'm delighted to welcome Kelly Barner back to have a chat about all the goings on in procurement this month. So Kelly, thanks for joining me again. Hey,
Phil, thanks for having me. And thank you to everybody who's jumped back in to listen.
No, I was really happy with some of the feedback that we got last time. So, as ever, if you ever have feedback to give us on any show, I'd love to hear it. But definitely encourage us to keep going. And, just as a recap for the format of This Month in Procurement, we're going to talk to start with about the pods that we've had on the show the previous month. Just a little bit of kind of going outside of the podcast itself. So I can talk a little bit more about some of the thoughts that I had, some of the kind of action items that I took away from the pods and that Kelly has as well. A little bit easier in this format than I can in the podcast itself, the interview itself. We'll talk a little bit about some of the news that we've come across in procurement this month, and then we have a single topic that we want to deep dive into, and that's actually going to be talking about a Hackett CPO survey that came out, I think, just a week or two ago, but has some results that I'm really fascinated with. And I'm looking forward to doing a little bit of a deep dive into that Hackett CPO report. Just some exciting news before we get started as well. So for the month of January, we had almost 11,000 podcast listens across the entire month. That was up 60% year on year. And I just wanted to say, just a real thank you, for being a part of the community that we're growing here at Art of Procurement, supporting the work that we do. It's obviously very motivating to us to see that it's having a bigger impact year on year, because that's what we're all about, is we want to help as many procurement professionals as possible really do what they can to elevate the role of procurement within their organizations, but also be inspired to try new things in their job. So just a thank you for tuning in and for helping us spread the word. All right, so I'm going to go, first of all, to just share some considerations from this month's podcast that we published throughout February of 2019. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, Kelly. So the first episode we had this month was with Jens Hentschel, and it was about redefining success in a customer-centric procurement organization. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you took away from that pod.
Yeah, I think for me it was interesting because, being a procurement person, anytime I hear a statistic, I always kind of jump right in on it. And one of the comments that he had made is that despite all of our investments in automation and all of our fascination with emerging technologies, most procurement professionals are still spending around 80% of their time doing tactical work. Mm-hmm. And that number really hit me, not only because it's so large, but also because it's the wrong flip of the Pareto principle. We would want it to be 80-20 the other way, right? 20% tactical that can't be avoided, 80% being strategic or thinking high level. And from that, he sort of extended this idea that because we're spending so much of our time in tactical mode, that we're toiling away, I actually think he said, which was a great way to put it. We're toiling away on a very low level, and we are completely missing the big picture. That what we really need to do is a combination of fighting how we allocate our time, but also consciously making the decision to pick our heads up from the tactical details and pay attention to the bigger picture things going on.
Yeah, and it's hard to really say that what the single root cause of that is. Because I think it's something we all understand, we empathize with, because it's something we're all challenged. We're all challenged in our daily jobs, certainly within procurement, that we're always fighting for, unfortunately, saving the next dime. And I know that's not true for 100% of the listeners out there, but most of the listeners, it's very, keep the lights on kind of work. And it's hard to dedicate the time to at least say, okay, I'm going to spend a certain amount of time in my week focusing on different activities, those activities that may not actually be, it's like the moonshot, I think, principle that Google has or had, where you spend the time every week doing something that is more long-term thinking, as opposed to just trying to put out the fires in front of you. And it's really hard to actually do that and to create that space.
Well, and I think a piece of it is, and I'm going to do something I typically hate, I'm going to completely make up a word. I think most of us are task driven, right? There's that great feeling you say, okay, this is what I have to do today. I'm going to make my big long list of things to do, or however you manage your time. And then you kind of set them up and knock them down. And it's not even so much that we're being tactical, right? We're being task-tical. We're so focused on getting all the little things done, or returning all the little phone calls, or answering all the emails. And I think the nice thing about what Jens had to say is that he connected the idea, okay, we're supposed to be more strategic. And what on earth does that mean? And he gave us two really fantastic, specific things to do that would make us more strategic. One is to be more customer-centric. And whether that means focusing on internal stakeholders or distributed buyers or the executive suite, or if that means thinking about the company's customers.
Yeah.
But he also offered up the challenge. Are you really listening when people are talking? Or are you focused on a task? Are you writing down a note? Are you thinking of the next thing you have to do? Those are both very hard things to do. But if we can shift our perspective to something more customer oriented, if we can force ourselves to put down our pens, put down our phones, and really listen when someone's talking, not even thinking of our response. Hard things to do, but strategic things to be sure.
Yeah, I think I could probably take up an entire podcast talking about this, but the idea of customer centricity, however you want to position that, I know it's a little bit of a buzzword right now.
Yeah.
But it's thinking of your business, or it's thinking of procurement as a business within a business. Essentially, that's it. So what would you do if this is your business and you're trying to grow your business? It may look very different to what you would do if you're a function trying to operate within, a process-driven mandate. Those two things don't get you to the same end result of ultimately building something that's sustainable that the company needs and wants. And there's so much, as I say, that I could dig into there. But just that mindset shift of I want to grow my category like it's a business. I want to treat this sourcing event like it's a business, or I want to treat my function or my team like it's a business that's fighting for, one, to sell our services, and two is fighting for investment, because we're always fighting for investment within the business, because every dollar that's invested in a procurement team has an opportunity cost of not being invested somewhere else. And so how can we best position ourselves to actually be the recipients of that investment? And I don't think that's something that we do well enough. And I would love to see us focus more on thinking like we're a business within a business.
Well, and if I had to put my finger on one thing that I think is truly preventing us from, it's fun to talk about entrepreneurial mindset or entrepreneurial procurement, but I think if there's anything that's preventing us from getting there, it's actually one of the core things that Andrew Daley talked about, and that was the idea of risk aversion.
Yeah.
That there is no such thing as a successful risk-averse entrepreneur. I mean, you look at certainly all of the Elon Musk types, right? Definitely not risk-averse.
No.
And I think that whether it's because we've been programmed to be defensive about information, or whether we're so focused on minimizing and planning for disruptions in the supply chain, we're sort of conditioned to have this attitude about risk. But when it comes to trying to be entrepreneurial, whether you're talking about the way you manage a category or you're talking about the way you manage an open position that you're interviewing for, you can't be risk averse and accomplish new things.
Yeah, that's a really important point. One of the things that Andrew was saying in terms of being risk averse is always looking to hire, or his experience of seeing hiring managers looking to hire ultimately people who look like them. And I don't mean look like them in terms of, their makeup as an individual person, but their
Sure.
experience level, their skill set, what they've done, the companies that they've worked for, because then you feel as though you know that person more, and so there's less of a chance that it will end up in being an unsuccessful hire, because you almost feel like you think like them, and so you know them, you know how to manage them. And yet a lot of hiring managers are trying to do things differently, and they set out on the process to look for somebody who's a little bit different and bring some diversity to the group, but they end up in a position where they're hiring somebody that looks like them.
And then they get mad that they do the exact same things that everybody else on the team already does. Isn't that I think it's an Einstein quote, right? The true definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing, but expecting different results. That can come back to bite us very easily in the recruiting space.
Yeah, one of the other things that he was saying that's interesting, just looking at the market, the hiring market in procurement, is how tech literacy is now seen as a key skill. And that should make sense, but it's something I think, again, that we don't naturally consider when we're looking at building up our skill sets as procurement professionals, because we often focus more on the technical element. How can I be a better negotiator? How can I show that I have saved 20% on a particular category, using perhaps traditional ways, maybe using them in a creative way, but it's all about the things that we always did, maybe just doing them a little bit better. And Andrew said one of the things that hiring managers are really struggling for right now, and this is within both the practitioner side and the consultants or the procurement service providers, is professionals who really understand where technology is going, how to leverage technology to improve their decision making, and how to help with change management as it comes to bringing in new technology.
But along with that idea of tech literacy, I mean, that's probably ironically, probably the top two desired competencies for almost any professional role in the world right now are a combination of tech literacy and then good soft skills, right? Because you have to be able to work with other people and communicate and resolve problems. But then as Andrew pointed out, let's say you do get this amazing person that has good, well-rounded business skills and good tech literacy. They have all kinds of other opportunities that they can pursue. What is the obligation that you create for your team and your company if you manage to pull in one of these rock stars? What do you then have to continue to do? It doesn't end with signing them and giving them their desk. Once you bring them in, how do you have to change the way you think about assigning projects, but also giving some amount of blue skies opportunity so that these amazing people you've snagged make the decision to stay, and so that you get the most ROI out of their time?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of creating a safe space, isn't it? We've, I think, talked about that before in the podcast, in how can you create an environment that allows people to fail. It goes back to that risk aversion a little bit as well, doesn't it? That we don't often, again, do a good job of really encouraging people to do new things and creating the environment where it's okay to fail as long as you learn from it and do it in a controlled way. So you don't want somebody obviously to fail and it be a disaster and it has a lot of negative implications for you, for your team, but you can do it in a controlled environment, whether it's a pilot, whether it's just something that's small, but it's applying new thinking to it. And that just takes away some of the risk. I'm always reminded of the interview that I had with Rory Sutherland when I think about things like this, because he talked about the reputational risk of making a decision, essentially.
Big
so
time.
That should always be at the forefront of our mind. How can we, when we're looking at doing something different or taking a risk, how can we minimize or mitigate the impact of any reputational risk or potential harm that comes with that, both for ourselves and for our stakeholder? Doing that, I think, it provides an environment where people are more likely to take some risks and try new things.
But it's also largely a matter of perception. I mean, I can think of a case where, okay, we have an open rec and we're going to bring somebody in with this broad, exciting, different skill set, and they're going to do different things and usher in change. And the stakeholders are happy because things are working differently. The executive team might say, yes, this is exactly the kind of direction we want to see procurement taking. But the rest of procurement may be going, we hate this guy. This is awful. He's changing everything. And so some people wanting change doesn't mean that everyone wants change. And so the reputational risk, you could certainly build bridges based on a change-based reputation in some areas and burn them at the exact same time with different people that aren't as open to the change.
Yeah. So the last podcast that we had this month, and this was last Monday, was an interview that I recorded with Matt Clark. Matt is the president and COO of Corcentric. We talked a little bit about something that's in the news right now, which is Corcentric's offer to acquire Determine, but also about accounts payable and the relationship between procurement and accounts payable. And there's a couple of reasons why I really wanted to do this interview and talk about that topic. And the first one has nothing to do with accounts payable. It's really just the notion of empathy and understanding the situation and position of our stakeholders. And I can only speak from personal experience to say that that's something that when I was a practitioner, I don't think I did as good a job as I could have done, as I've matured my thinking for sure. Because we're often looking at things from our point of view, why aren't they doing that? That just doesn't make sense without really understanding the pressures they're under. And because ultimately, while we have pressures in procurement, how do I become more relevant? How can I take advantage of technology? How do I make sure that doesn't impact my own personal job or my career? Every other area of the business, they have the same questions, and more than likely have the same existential crisis that they're considering and that they're worried about that impacts what they do. And I'm not sure that we give enough thought to that when we're thinking about how we best communicate with other functions and other people within the organization.
Well, and this is kind of the flip side or the dark side to that idea of running procurement like it's a business. Mm-hmm. Because on the one hand, I think it introduces a healthier attitude about risk. I think it changes ownership. I think it hopefully creates a growth mindset. But at the end of the day, procurement is not a business. And just like no man is an island, if we do a wonderful job integrating and automating and streamlining procurement from the very first moment something enters our territory until the very last second before it exits, if those 2 points are broken and the process as a whole doesn't achieve the objectives of the other business functions that we're supposed to be working with, then it doesn't matter what kind of growth mindset we have. We still have to work as an enterprise, and we have to, kind of all the gears and cogs have to work together and click in time. And if you don't have that larger perspective of where things come together, at the end of the day, you're going to be held back in terms of the impact that you can have.
Yeah, and with accounts payable specifically, I think that they have such an important role to play in basically two areas that's very strategic to procurement. And yet, again, I can only speak from my own personal experience. I'd always think of accounts payable as being very tactical and transactional, and that I only really had anything to do with them when there was a problem. A supplier isn't getting paid. I've sent the email to AP 3 times. Nothing still happened. Okay, I got to go and dig into what's going on, because we're always just managing by inbox. Right. And all the emails that come in. And so that was ultimately the extent of my my working with them was, and I didn't see them as being a strategic role that they could play in helping me deliver more. But when you think about it, the fundamental basis of being strategic in procurement is understanding your spend. And we struggle with that because data that goes into our spend cubes and that's reported out through our spend analytics tools often just isn't good data. And so it's only as good as the hours and hours and hours that you spend, or if you're fortunate enough to have a system that does a lot of that for you in trying to cleanse the data. If the data that was picked up out of invoices was cleaner, was stronger, was more relevant, it would make our job so much easier in terms of understanding what exactly we do spend. And so there's we need to be working with accounts payable. What do we need to do to make sure that you're either, one, keying in the right data or from an invoice, or two, working with our suppliers so the suppliers are putting enough invoice data that can then be taken from accounts payable and keyed in or scanned in, if you have any e-invoices. So I think that's one of the points that we miss with them. And the other then is on the savings capture. We're always challenged with, I don't believe your numbers. I don't see that the procurement numbers are hitting the bottom line.
That's right.
So are you really saving? Well, accounts payable can do a great job in actually helping to identify where the savings actually have been made, again, at an invoice level. And I think that that's just something that we miss.
Well, and he pointed out that, you mentioned, and I think we're all guilty of this, of not viewing AP in a way that reflects their true potential. But I don't think we're alone. Matt offered up the statistic that only 1 in 10 companies see a strategic role for AP. And part of that, I believe this was his opinion, was that companies simply don't recognize the value of the data that AP is sitting on. And whether that's a question of negotiated savings transitioning to realized, or whether that's a question of cash flow, or whether it's a question of, how are we doing in terms of payment timing with our smaller suppliers, with our strategic suppliers? How are we making policy decisions versus good contextualized decisions with corporate cash flow? I think it is going to require a real mindset shift, that we need to look not just at what they do, right? This is getting away from the task focus. It's not just about what they do, but it's about the information that gets created in that process, what they know, the recommendations they can make, and how that can be sort of pulled back in via a circular economy type thing and be allowed to change the rest of the way the enterprise works.
Yeah. All right, well, let's transition to some news from February. And a couple of things I want to talk about very briefly. They're related to ATA procurement. We've got a lot of things that are going on at the moment, which is great, sometimes hard to keep up with. But we had our first ATA procurement live session. That was, as we record this, that was last week. So as this goes out, it's probably going to be like 10 days or so ago. It was great. It was taking essentially a podcast format, taking it to a webinar. We had 35 questions received before the event. So the vast majority of questions that I actually asked were led by questions that we received from the community in advance. So it was everything that I hoped it would be and more, to be honest with you. Of course, as is typical, sometimes technical snafus get in the way. So we had, if anybody was on that AOP Live, or anyone who didn't get their notifications and calendar invites, there was an issue with our webinar provider. So that means that we're looking at who do we use for our webinar provider the next time round, because we learn from each one of these. But in terms of the event itself, I thought it was a great event, and I'm really excited to do another one next month. We're going to have another one that I'll be sharing with you a little bit later about. The next item of news I have is a partnership that we have with ProcureCon. So I'm sure many of you know that a lot of the interviews, the practitioner side interviews that I do, that I record on site, I record at ProcureCon events. And we just have inked a partnership for 2019 with ProcureCon. There's going to be a lot of interviews that I'm going to be recording at ProcureCon Indirect East that is actually coming up March 25th to the 27th here in Florida. But the reason I wanted to mention this was that we actually have agreed a 25% discount for all practitioners who are interested, who are listeners of ATA Procurement, who are interested in going to any ProcureCon event in North America in 2019. So all of the ProcureCon events are listed at artofprocurement.com/ProcureCon. And you can see the discount code. It's the same code for every single event. That's on the page there as well. So if you are interested, use the code. You get 25% off your ticket for any ProcureCon event. We don't get compensated for that, but what it does is it just helps ProcureCon know who ATA Procurement community members are. So yeah, if you're interested in going to a ProcureCon event, that website again, artofprocurement.com/ProcureCon. It's going to list all the 11 events that they have during 2019. Now, the last thing is actually just to build on that. I mentioned that there's ProcureCon Indirect East. That's going to be March 25th to 27th. I'll actually be speaking with Joanna Martinez really looking forward to that. So if you are going to be at ProcureCon, just let me know, and we can catch up. I always like to kind of take relationships that I have with listeners and with people on LinkedIn and bring them into the flesh. And there's no better way to do that than a conference. So if you're going to be at ProcureCon, just shoot me an email, send me a DM on LinkedIn, and we will do what we can to arrange to meet up while I'm there. And the second one is I'll also be attending Ariba Live. I'll be in a breakout session and also doing some recording there. If you're going to be at Ariba Live, that's April the 1st to the 3rd in Austin, Texas. So again, just let me know you're going to be there. Let's do what we can to catch up in person. As I add more events, I will be letting you know, because it looks like there's going to be a few places that I'm going to be going to over the next 2 or 3 months. So moving on to the last section of today's podcast, we want to have a discussion every month around a particular topic. And this one is a Hackett report that was just published. Well, the date on it is February 2019. Kelly and I came across it earlier this week. And it's titled 2019 CPO Agenda, Building Next Generation Capabilities. And it really stood out to me. There's a number of reasons why this stood out. You know, a lot of these reports, they can be pretty similar, but I've always liked the Hackett report for what they do in terms of comparing priorities of CPOs based on at least the study that they've performed versus what they believe to be development priority areas. And those two things don't always match. Before I share some of my thoughts, though, Kelly, I'd love to just get your perspective on what you kind of found in the report when you started digging deep into it.
Well, I think the thing that's so interesting about it, and I fully agree with you about Hackett Group reports. I think it's nice because they don't just report the data, they don't just make the data, look nice in charts and graphs, but they actually give it some really deep thought. So it's not a long report. I would definitely advocate anybody download it and read it. It's an open access thing.
Yeah, it's like 6 pages. Like you said, it's not 50 slides of images that are sometimes difficult to understand. It's short, concise, and really brings out some key points.
And the interesting thing about that is it's a quick read, but I would definitely say it's a long think. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things where there's actually one really great chart where they looked at, okay, where are CPOs investing their money from a capability building perspective? And then they're running that against what the CPOs are reporting that the enterprise needs from procurement. And what you get is this really, and this is my word, scary disconnect between what is required and where we're placing our emphasis. Yeah. And they end up calling us, based on that gap, these 5 critical development areas. So they're analytics, alignment between talent and business needs, supplier relationship management, agility, and customer centricity. And if all of those things are important, the only one that at least 50% of the CPOs are investing in is analytics. And that's great. I mean, we've been talking about technical literacy and how important that is and the value upside of data. But I think what's really interesting is that analytical skills they're not necessarily tactical, but they're certainly quantitative, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas we're saying the other things that are really important, they're much more on the soft end. The alignment, the talent, SRM, agility, customer centricity, whatever all these happy, softer things mean, but it's not necessarily what the company wants us to be. So there's really kind of 2 big questions for me that come out of the report. One is, if we say these 5 things are important to us, why aren't we investing in them, either through recruiting or through training and skills development? And the other question is what procurement wants to be, either based on our own ambition or based on feedback that we're getting from stakeholders, in alignment with what the enterprise has decided they want us to be? Because if those 2 things don't come together, there's a big issue we need to resolve.
Yeah, the disconnect between what the enterprise wants us to be, if we're pursuing what we believe the enterprise wants us to be, the question to me is, how have they made that determination? Because I think one of the things that I see is that the enterprise wants us to be who we've told them we can be. Mm-hmm. And, obviously we've told them in most cases that we can be the people who go and put in place strong commercial agreements that help minimize the risk of being overcharged or taken advantage of saving some money, of perhaps having a handle on supply chain risk in some organizations. But we've set out the business case and the ROI for procurement very much based around a savings calculation model. And so is that all the organization believes that we're capable of? And so that's where we're investing at being better at that, because that's what we've told them is the ROI, versus all these things that are the softer skills, which would position us as, I think, in a more commercial role that I think we desire, but we're not putting the investment dollars as much. And I don't want to speak generally and stereotype all procurement organizations, because clearly there's a number of procurement organizations who are investing in this space. We're just not doing it as a community.
Well, and I think it ends up being such a challenge, because it reminds me a lot about what someone told me once about getting a promotion, that no one looks at someone and says, you know what, she would make a really good director. Let's promote her. No, what happens in the real world is you end up one bit at a time taking on the role of being a director. And then somebody notices, hey, she's basically been functioning as a director for the last 6 or 9 months. Let's promote her and give her the money so that she doesn't leave. You kind of have to be either doing the work or capable of doing the work before you get the official recognition. And I think that translates here. So procurement has a challenge on two fronts. We need to find a way to bring in these additional capabilities, the things beyond analytics, the relationship building, the agility, the customer centricity. But we also need to sell the importance of those things to the rest of the enterprise. And so you end up in this chicken or egg. How can we get the funds to go ahead and invest in these things if the company doesn't necessarily see the value? But how is the company going to see the value if we're not doing these things to demonstrate the results? I do think it creates a challenge that we're going to have to apply a lot of our talk about influencing internal communication, listening to what people are saying, right, focusing on their interests in terms of how we present things. But it's certainly not an easy obstacle to get past.
No, I remember speaking, this could be a couple of years ago, to Mark Pereira, and we were talking about really supplier relationship management. We were talking in the context of Mark and his company's Visible platform, and how the necessity of changing the way that we're measured from cost savings only to having a more of a balanced scorecard, but that ultimately that doesn't happen overnight. So it's certainly a journey. You have to start somewhere, and it may be that this year you're going to set your goals that 90% of them are what your traditional goals were, and 10% of them are new goals that are more related to the customer centricity that we talked about before, connecting more closely with other metrics than are non-savings related. Because at a category level, I think we all understand, or most of us understand, this is how my category stakeholder is going to be measured. And so how can I build a metric that connects with that? And that metric in most occasions isn't going to result in direct cost savings. So you start with 90% cost savings and perhaps 10% of these metrics that are more aligned, but that aren't specifically, I'm going to save this much money. Then you start to get advocacy within the business on how that's transforming relationships, and you're able to bring that over time like a scale. So next year maybe it's 25% of my metrics are there, and now only 75% is on cost savings. The year after it's 50-50. It's not, again, something that happens overnight, but we got to start somewhere. And that provides a really good opportunity to start doing it, to build advocates around a new way of measuring performance. Because I've always, again, thought that it's very unlikely that we're going to get fired as procurement professionals if we have the full backing of our stakeholders. Right. But if you go and you may save 200% of your savings target, and but everybody in the organization doesn't want to work with procurement, that's when you see leadership churn, because they want to bring somebody in who's going to better partner with the business. So it's almost riskier to me of going and just continuing to rest on the cost savings laurels than it is to start bringing in other value drivers and then just changing the balance over time.
Well, it's actually a lot like what we were saying before about bringing in a true change driver. It might make the C-suite happy, but stakeholders or other procurement folks unhappy. This is very much the same, that if we're looking at trying to do really big value-oriented things, maybe that makes stakeholders happy, but it might make the CFO unhappy because what he really wants is more realized savings that we can demonstrate through AP. And it's going to be figuring out what those two groups need, finding some way to reconcile them, but then kind of completing the triangle, helping those two groups make sure that the C-suite knows what feedback and input we're getting from stakeholders, and making sure stakeholders understand, listen, we're not just coming in to take away your budget. A, we're working under a directive, and B, this is in fact connected to larger, more strategic enterprise objectives. It's helping everybody get a complete picture, because we're always going to be balancing the notion of getting savings and working through the value-oriented stuff. That challenge is always going to exist.
Yeah. Now, as we're talking, I'm looking at the report at the same time, and one of the things that just jumps out to me here is you talked about the different areas that we're investing in. The area of least investment is data and system security. It's seen as not being a priority at all. And then there's another chart, the next chart in the document, talks about percentage of companies, what are they ranking as high risk? And the biggest jump, in fact, it's the biggest risk that's identified. It's also the biggest jump from year on year, 2018 to 2019, is cyber and information security. So we've identified it as a huge risk, and yet it's the area that we're investing the least in. And I think that's just kind of encapsulates what this report is trying to say.
Absolutely. So anybody that, actually, I think when you initially sent it to me, your first comment was, I can't believe more isn't being made of this. So please do go get it and read it and share your thoughts, because there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen around this. There's an awful lot that I think different people are going to take different things away from the report, but it's great data to start a number of different conversations based on. Yeah,
the last one I just want to jump on was the leading focus, the leading transformation focus is modernized application platforms.
Yeah.
Which, we see that in our consulting business. There's a lot of demand right now, I think, for procurement organizations who are looking to do things to upgrade their technology capabilities and what they have access to. And I just wonder if your perspective, is that because we're looking at new technology, or is that because we've just had so much underinvestment in technology as a procurement group?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with either how people are interpreting the word modernize. I mean, does that sort of suggest to people, AI, machine learning, blockchain, right? Is that what modernize is suggesting to people? Or is it a more consumer-driven thing where the experience, the UI, all of that is a lot more intuitive, works a lot more like the B2C applications that we're using in our personal lives? I think how people interpret that notion of modernize is important, because fundamentally, not a ton has changed about how RFPs work. Sure, there's been a lot of improvement to the automation during the, contract lifecycle process, but fundamentally, it kind of all, works the way it was designed to work. Yeah. So modernizing to me suggests either consumerizing or bringing in some of these newer emerging technologies that are going to either automate more or just make the whole process smarter and more responsive.
All right, well, if anybody's interested in the report, like I say, I'd highly recommend you take a look at it. It's called the 2019 CPO Agenda, Building Next Generation Capabilities. And what I'll do is I'll include a link to the download page within our show notes for today's episode. But you can also, I'm sure, just find it by Googling the title. You'll go straight there. It does require you enter some information, just the usual, your name, email address to get it. But I'd highly recommend you take a look and start thinking about, do we need to shift where we're investing in? Or are we investing in the things that are actually going to deliver the results, or prioritizing in a way that's going to deliver the results that we want to see? So I want to finally wrap up for this month by just letting you know what's coming in March. We have 3 different episodes all lined up. We've actually already recorded them, so they're ready to go. We're going to be speaking with Ian McKenzie. Ian is actually a good friend of the show. He is an executive recruiter in the UK. We're going to be talking about technology, but in context of the hiring process, and whether technology used in the hiring process is something that is maybe appropriate for higher volume recruiting and maybe more junior recruiting, but isn't as effective when you're looking for the exact right person for the right job. So it's an interesting discussion. It also brings in the idea of empathy into the hiring process, which is interesting because we've just been talking about empathy from a stakeholder perspective, but something that's often overlooked. We are going to be speaking with Louis Bastone. So Louis is a category manager who is kind of on the fast track within his organization. This show, we rarely do a show like this. So this one's going to be aimed actually at procurement professionals, or let's say professionals who are considering investing in a procurement career. So we talk a little bit about, what does procurement look like? What does a typical day in procurement look like? And obviously to a lot of our more senior listeners, this is something that perhaps won't be as relevant. And, that's okay. We don't try and make a show that's going to appeal to everybody every single week. But it is interesting from a perspective of if you're trying to convince people to come into the procurement profession, within your recruiting, or perhaps when you're looking at bringing interns into the profession. It's a really good intro, heard from somebody who has only been in the profession for, not that many years, on what procurement looks like and why he feels that it's such an exciting career journey for him.
But he has a lot to say that's actually relevant to senior folks. Not to jump the gun. I'm so lucky I get to hear these things early. But around procurement's legacy is really the question. What is the future of procurement going to look like? Because the hiring decisions we make today are going to make that foundation.
Yeah. And then the last podcast that we'll have next month is with Cievo. And it's the podcast. It's actually the AOP Live that we recorded last month. So part of the AOP Live series is that typically a couple of months after we've done the webinar, we'll then bring the conversation into the Ad Procurement podcast feed. So look out for that in the middle of March, where we will be replaying the webinar, which was all around building a procurement AI game plan. And we have some really cool downloadable content as well related to that gives you what you need essentially to start building your game plan if you haven't really set out on an AI journey yet.
And this is actually a great opportunity to preview from an audio perspective what the dynamic was like during AOP Live. Mm-hmm. I was sort of working the switchboard as we were there. We had, as Phil said, a lot of questions come in early, but we had a lot of questions also come in during the event, which was great. And it gave us a lot to juggle, which we were grateful for in the moment. Absolutely. And fun fact, anybody that doesn't know Semeli, we learned 2 really interesting things about him during this process. One, that he is a huge soccer fan, or I'll say for those of you listening in Europe, football. He's a huge football fan.
Thank you, Kelly.
And a little nod to the British and European folks listening. And fun fact, despite how successful he's been in technology and procurement, his family was disappointed that he did not pursue a career in reindeer farming. Yeah. So interesting little background twist. That was a first. I mean, no one necessarily expects to end up in procurement, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that reindeer farming was originally on the table.
Yeah, I think the first Laplander that we'll have on the show, for sure.
Not the last, hopefully.
No. So that's it. That's it for the month. Kelly, who are we going with next week?
Yes, so next week we're going to kick off the month of March with Louis. And as I said, he's got a really interesting take on if you're someone in the climbing part of your career and you're considering procurement as an option, he's got a great point of view for you. If you're someone in a management role and you're looking to bring in someone with the diverse skill set that we talked about in the context of Andrew's podcast in February. I think he's got some great ideas there around where you can pull from other functions, and just how to know if someone is going to achieve what you're looking to accomplish through a specific role. So it'll get the month off to a good start.
All right. Well, look out for that next Monday. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this month in procurement. Again, send us any feedback. Send us any areas of discussion that you'd like us to talk about. If there's anything that you see in the news for procurement, send it our way, because we'd love to make this as interactive as we possibly can. Kelly, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thanks.
Have a great month.
Yeah, see you all next month. Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.